thank you very much, Shane and Arias, for inviting me this chance to share with you some of my insights. I thought when Shane asked me to talk about wealth and accumulation Southeast Asia, I thought that maybe it's an appropriate time to talk about it because, as you very well know, the son of Imelda and Ferdinand Marcos is assuming the presidency by the end of the month. So I thought maybe a good way to talk about is to talk about the Marcoses now, and my first slide is about Imelda Marcos. You guys are familiar with her. There's a wonderful documentary by uh, the Green guy. It's called The Kingmaker. It's available on YouTube now by Lauren Greenfield, where she manages to get Imelda to talk about her wealth and how she wants to become mother of the nation. So, what is Imelda Marcos famous for? This phrase. When she was allowed to go back to the Philippines in 1998 and allowed to be interviewed, she said, "Well, we own everything in the Philippines." And as a result of what she's done, she has acquired these different monikers. She's referred as the Iron Butterfly, so American journalists refer to her as Iron Butterfly. The Philippines, the word emeldefic, which became a new word, meaning if you're emeldefic, you're ostentatious. Philippine politicians refer to her as Madame. Her friends call her Meldy. And a new one that has emerged after 1986 is Shoakolic. Okay. She's known for 30,000 pairs of shoes. I can explain what happened later of that. Well, the interesting thing is that Mrs. Marcos became wealthy. Her wealth, the accumulation of wealth, all is new, was new and really fairly recent after World War II. The source of original wealth in the Philippines has always been land. The Philippines, as you guys, folks very well know, was a colony of Spain and the United States. And in the late Spanish era and throughout most of the 40 years of American rule, the Philippine economy was very much consigned to producing raw material products, principally for the US market. So land was important. The old elites were landed. This is an example of how huge the hacienda of the Aquino family, one of Mrs. Marcos's rivals, this hacienda produces sugar compared to the size of the city of Manila, two cities of Manila, and it's such a very huge one. So the Philippine economy and the old elite depended much on these kinds of products that were needed in European Western industries. There was also a big land, so smaller but still fairly, um, huge, rice estate, landed elites that were, producing rice, especially for the domestic market. This was the By the 1950s, however, the Philippine government had intentions of becoming an industrial nation, trying to copy the United States, but this kind of industrialization was based on two important features. One is the complete dominance of American, especially American and Japanese transnational corporations in the most important segments of the industrial sector, and the Philippine industry is consigned mainly to producing consumer goods. Okay, this was the best so far in the 50s and the 60s. This was the most industrialized. This TV was the most industrialized, most important feature of an industrialized Philippines. Oh, sorry. The Philippines was also constrained by one market. Up until even today, the U.S. remains its single biggest market. After the war, however, this old elite, which emerged in the late Spanish and American colonial period, continued to rule Philippine politics until about 1972. But after the war, a new kind of elite emerged. Okay, and this was an elite that had no land, but relied mainly in accumulating power through control of government offices. Those of you who grew up in New York are familiar with the spoil system, Tammany Hall. Unfortunately, one of the things that you taught us back home in the colonial era was how to run our machines. So these elite had no lands, but they were mainly former guerrillas. And when the Philippines became a republic, sought to accumulate wealth through control of uh, government offices. They were regarded as extremely corrupt and exploitative, but because of American support through the Cold War, the United States continued to preserve them. Marcos, for example, is a classic guerrilla leader. Alongside these elites are at the local level, most of them are strong men or strong women, dependent mainly on the power of the family. And for a while, until about recently, people win political power during elections through the three Gs, as we call it three Gs: guns, goons, and gold. My father tried to run, but he had no gun, one goon, and no gold. So, and they control the legislative office, the House of Representatives, the Philippine Senate, where much of these resources are being, are approved, are raised, and disbursed, and but also in the local government, provinces and the cities and town level, of which are themselves the base of a lot of people in Congress. So it is this new elite, therefore, that emerged, of which Marcos became the most representative. By 1969-70, there was so much, for different reasons, the Philippine political system, which was patterned initially about the United States, entered a crisis, and in 1972, here's an example of how I'm sorry, how politicians, this new elite, saw the state in themselves. So this is the Senate president. Think of Charles Schumer saying this. Difficult to imagine somebody this is to say this. We are all going to hell. We are hypocrites, and this was the classic statement that Mrs. Marcos would repeat. In 1972, Marcos declares martial law to supposedly to contain a communist threat, a communist oligarchic threat, to stabilize an economic system that was in crisis, and to create what he called a new society that would recast and enhance and promote Philippine development. Marcos ruled for 15 years together with his wife, Mrs. Imelda, and this regime became known as the regime of conjugal dictatorship. Okay, what does conjugal dictatorship mean? Essentially, this: first, the foundation of Mr. Marcos was the military and the technocracy, but economically, remember, he's a product of the 1946 new elite. These Marcos dictatorship rested on using the government, using the state as a resource to enhance their wealth, but also to develop what became known as crony capitalism. I found this the other day at the U.S. State Department, U.S. Archives, where former diplomats in the United States who were assigned to the Philippines were interviewed about their experience, and I thought this was very appropriate. This is Ambassador. This is the Charles Diaper of Philip Kaplan in 1985-87 when Marcos fell, and this is this is the one time when Mr. Marcos actually admitted that he had cronies. Now, crony capitalism consisted of the following: okay, creating monopolies, awarding government loans, takeover of enterprises, raiding of the public treasury, issuance of presidential decrees to amass wealth, kickbacks and commissions, creating shell corporations, but foreign aid, scheming of foreign aid and international assistance. All of this wealth then is sent abroad under universities' overseas bank accounts. So if you will notice, the means in which the Marcoses accumulated wealth was not through land, was not through the old system of creating domestic industries that would complement smaller domestic industries that would complement transnational corporations, but using the state, using the government, by which from which as a source of spoils and funds, and from there create this empire. So that's the first thing that's interesting about accumulation of wealth in Southeast Asia after the war. So it focused on consumer goods, trade, and energy. Okay. Rarely do you find a Southeast Asian business enterprise that aspires to create a car, to go into high technology, etc. It's almost dependent on government using funds from the state, officials using funds from the state, and then investing in kinds of industries where they could monopolize. Okay, that is very critical to the Philippines as an export dependent economy, which is trade, energy, and consumer goods. Now, a classic example of this is this. So, Mrs. Imelda Marcos's brother. And if you notice the kinds of corporation he establishes, it is on trade. Of course, he stole money. Herminio Decini is his mother, his wife, was the first cousin of Mrs. Marcos. And I'll explain it to you in a later slide on how this engineer accumulated so much wealth by using the powers of the presidency to control logging concessions, cigarette industry, and later on, the effort, the plan of a government to create a nuclear power plant to offset to offset dependence on oil. That power plant disappeared, never got into production, but the Cine got 50.6 million. The other brother is this, Benjamin Coque Romualdez, the youngest brother, Imelda. Again, if you notice the kinds of enterprises he is into, energy, mining industries, energy, transportation, but he also controlled the newspaper network, an essential feature in the Philippines in the Marcos dictatorship way of controlling information. Lucio Tan is a Chinese, is still very much at play now. Accumulated wealth mainly through imported cigarettes, under the table deals. When Mrs. Marcos said we own everything, she was actually pointing at Tan and said, whatever you own, airlines, banks, beer, agricultural export agriculture, constructions, consumer, the tourism industry, we own that. Okay. And how did they do this? How did the Marcoses do this? How did Imelda and Ferdinand use the state in creating a niche for their cronies? And here's one example. Okay, this is in the scene, as I mentioned, the engineer Marcos's golfing partner, husband of Mrs. Marcos's first cousin. The first thing the cine decides to form a tobacco filters corporation with a Swiss partner, and Marcos then releases a decree that increases tobacco tariff against the local the corporation that used to control these filters in the Philippines, and then exempting the Chinese corporation. The rival company therefore declares bankruptcy by the late 70s, and then Bersini proceeds to consolidate his rule by taking over this, setting up a new company, which was then backed up by Marcos, signing a presidential decree that lowers the import duties for acetate tow, which is a chemical used in tobacco production. By the 1980s, the cine was in control of 75% of the cigarette industry in the Philippines. So think of 70, he declares martial law in 70. In the 1980, his crony and a golfing partner, who's an unknown engineer, becomes the most dominant, monopolizes the tobacco industry in the Philippines. Another example, if they create monopolies, the other thing that the Marcoses were famous for is a complete takeover corporations. This is the Lopez family, old elite sugar family. They accumulated their wealth through sugar and export, production and exports to the United States. Very, very old oligarchic family, used to be the main funders of any presidential aspirant. Marcos takes advantage of them. They form an alliance. And in 69, they decided that Marcos was indispensable. Marcos fights back, declares martial law. And what the Lopez's, the industrial base of the Lopez's was this thing called Meralco, Manila Electric Company, which supplied electricity throughout most of Manila. Marcos declares martial law and then allows Mrs. Marcos and her brother, okay, to take over, the Manila Electric Company, first by destroying the power base, the economic base of the Lopezes, and then forcing using the power of the state. Marcos jails his brother and then says, okay, apart from the fact that you are going to give up 33% of your wealth because you're not having any money anymore, we are going to jail your brother. Okay. And the brother was jailed. In the meantime, the two, Imelda and Benjamin Romualdez, create this privately owned Meralco Foundation after the arrest of the business, and then ask the family, demands that from the family to buy the 33%, okay, with a down payment of 10,000 pesos. So the company was worth 20 million dollars then in 1972. The Romualdez says through the Meralco Foundation just says we're going to give you 10,000, and there's a loophole in the agreement where we can delay the repayment of the rest of the money. Marcos fell in 86, and the only money that they really give this elite was 10,000 pesos. Promptly after controlling, after taking over the Meralco, the Marcoses then increases electricity rates by 100%, and then takes advantage on an executive order signed by the president using the oil crisis of the 70s to have this as a permanent feature. Ability to adjust rates automatically if there are problems with the oil price increase, especially the support of crude oil. Marcos was ousted in 1986. The Lopez family recovered their control of the business, but out of the 33%, they only had 16%. The Lopez's fate remained unlucky because under President Duterte, Duterte first forced them to close their television network. So how much was Marcos's? How much was or did how much the Marcos's? How much the wealth now of the Marcoses? According to economic researchers in the Philippines, if you approximate it by today's rate, this is how much the Marcoses are worth. These are the other top 10 families, business families in the country. Consumers, real estate, brokerage, airline, construction, real estate, consumers, Jollibee, consumers, airport, beer. And so this is how much people now have assessed the Marcos are worth for. And gives you an example of how wealthy they were. Is that in 86, when they were kicked out of power, the United States had to supply 2 transport planes to carry this amount of wealth that Mrs. Marcos brought here to Hawaii. It's just amazing. And a lot of this were, especially the jewelry, were put in, senior people's pampers. Because Marcos had a kidney problem then, and he was going to the bathroom a couple of times. So Mrs. Marcos just stuffed all the jewelries into the pamper and took 2 huge American airplanes, cargo planes, to do that. What has happened of late? Well, the new government in 86 set up the Presidential Commission on Good Government to try to recover the wealth, the hidden wealth of the Marcoses. So far, and until 3 years ago, 2001, this was only how much the amount of money that the Presidential Commission on Good Government had recovered. Under President Aquino, this was the total amount. So it's still very much small. In fact, if you look at watch the Kingmaker documentary, you'll see examples of ostentatious displays of Mrs. Marcos, displays of Mrs. Marcos of the wealth she accumulated. And so what has the Philippine government done to use with the recovered wealth of Marcos? One is big chunk of it goes to land reform. It's a huge. The Philippines has always had a huge uh, discrepancy in land ownership in the rural countryside, and land reform was always a major political issue. This one is used especially for both for court cases, and also the setting up of investigation teams to track the Marcos billions. 199 millions were awarded to human rights victims of human rights violations under the Marcos dictatorships. A part of that, thanks to the Hawaii trial court here, which awarded the victims that much money and convicted the Marcoses for human rights violations. And the other one was this, which is a result of a crony operation where one of Marcos's move was to monopolize the control and sale of coconuts in the global market, leading to a collapse of the coconut industry, which has yet not recovered until today. So this is how much has been recovered. The only problem is that, can this continue? Can the Philippine government continue to get back the billions that the Marcoses have stolen? Alas, not, because we just have a new president. The son of Ferdinand Imelda Marcos, Ferdinand Marcos II, is set to become the president at the end of the month. And one of the promises he made is to rewrite Philippine history under the name of in the name of objectivity, and to restore the family name, uh, into the pantheon of honored presidential families. So that, in a sense, is in a short way of explaining how wealth has been accumulated in countries like the Philippines after 46. You see echoes of this in Indonesia, Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia. Some of these countries have been able to overcome it, but the main source of wealth of this post-war elite essentially initially was always the resources and the coffers of the respective governments. Thank you.